right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, and with me today is a living legend, someone who's written more books than anyone else in this space. At least, in my opinion, he is probably one of our best guests to have on the show. Somebody who's written on a large variety of topics, from the cosmic war to the secret space program and so many things in between. But today, Dr. Joseph P. Farrell joins me here on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, hopefully to focus on Thrice Great Hermetica and the Janus Age, which I definitely recommend folks go and pick up. It's available on his website, gizadeathstar.com. And to start, I guess, Doctor, I'd like to ask you where this book fits into the rest of your books, because I've heard you describe your work as sort of each book sort of lining up in a certain order, and I'm wondering where this one fits in with the rest.
Well, it is true. I try, and all of my books are connected. If people sit down and read them, they'll quickly latch onto that. But they're also designed to stand on their own. They were conceived in a particular order, but you can read them in any order. That book, as far as I'm concerned, was an attempt to try and connect some dots between an ongoing kind of financial cosmology that you see beginning way back in Mesopotamia, all the way up. That's basically been the paradigm all the way up to the present. And by that, I mean, stop and ask yourself this question. When was the last time that humanity, or the bulk of the population of humanity, lived under a financial system where money was not monetized debt? That's a long time.
Goes back very far, yeah.
It goes back very far. Now, we've been in this country under a mixed system. You know, I remember as a boy spending silver certificates. Well, you know, you don't find those anymore. I remember as a boy spending United States notes. You don't find those anymore. They're nothing but Federal Reserve notes. So it was designed, that book, to kind of bridge the gap between that aspect of finance, and also to bridge the gap between some physics interests of mine and also the occult and secret society aspects. So that book is really an important book. If you look at all of my books, it's a very important one because it's trying to tie those themes that you find in the other books together.
Absolutely. And I will say, you know, before I ever listened to really any podcast, I found your books probably at Barnes & Noble or some used bookstore. And I didn't realize there was any order, and I'm grateful that you don't have to read them in order, because I synchronistically found them in an order that was particular to me and what I was looking for. So in that sense, I think you've done a really beautiful service to this community, elevating the consciousness. And, you know, it's rare for someone with your pedigree of education to tackle these subjects with such precision. So, yeah, you know, compliments and whatnot aside for now, it's just such a great opportunity to have you here on the show. So to pull forward through here, let's get into this topic, because the beginning of this starts way back in Babylon, but it's safe to say that without these Venetians, we may not have this going on, at least here in America, right? I mean, they play a very large role. Obviously, you wrote a whole book that focuses on them, but they are sort of behind the scenes with the Templars even as well. So maybe we can start by discussing the difference between what we know as the cover story for the Templars and what really happened.
Well, the Templars, the story is, and it's actually an accurate story so far as it goes, but what most people lack is the ability to draw out the implications of the story. So let's look at the story. The Templars were a military crusading order, like the Knights Hospitaller, like the Teutonic Knights. They were one of the three big military crusading orders that arose in medieval Western Europe after the schism between the Eastern and Western churches. The Templars built priories and so on all over Western Europe and later on in the Holy Land as well. And they became a close ally with the city-state of Venice. Okay. They did wage crusades both in the Middle East, and the important thing that we need to remember is that the Templars were largely the ones responsible for the Reconquista in Spain and bringing the Spanish monarchy to power, and then, of course, ending the Moorish occupation and civilization in Spain. So the Templars were wildly successful in terms of some of their military operations. But let's look behind the scenes. What are the Templars? The Templars were given a special charter from the papacy itself. And this is really the first chink in the armor that you see, particularly in the Christian West, because up to this point, the church had basically forbidden the lending of money at usury, at interest. Okay. Now, in the Byzantine Empire, the government itself could do that, but no one else could do that privately. What the Templars thus represent is the first attempt by the church to allow a corporate charter to a private group that would allow them to do this. In other words, allow them to bank. So they get this charter from the papacy, and this creates, for the first time in Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire, this is crucial to understand for people. It creates an organization that can transfer wealth intergenerationally. Now, an individual Templar was not allowed to own property, but the order itself could. So the order became fabulously wealthy. Now, on top of this, the Templars borrowed from Islam the idea of the note of hand. It was the ability to make a deposit in an institution, receive an encoded note, like a check today, that you could take to another Templar priory all the way across Europe or in the Holy Land, present that note, and receive your money. Okay, so they invented a system of financial clearing that allowed them not only to accumulate wealth intergenerationally, but to transfer wealth from one place to another securely. All right, this is another huge revolution. Now, the reason that they ally with the Venetians is, of course, the Venetians are bankers, and the Venetians invent essentially the same system. They take the Templar system and employ it in Venice on the banks at the Rialto, where you have a banca discreta. So in other words, when you do business in Venice, you can simply deposit your money in a bank, and then you go to a merchant in Venice, to draw on Shakespeare's play. You go to a merchant in Venice and you tell them that you've got so much money on account. Can I have so much barley and so on? You give that person a bill, a note, a bill of sale. That person can go to the bank and receive the money. And if that person happens to bank at a different bank than you do, that bank on the Rialto simply makes a ledger entry, debit this account and credit that account, and so on and so forth. So in other words, banking gets started. Now, the usual story is that Venice, because of this method of banking, which essentially is the bank system of banking we use today, the usual story is that Venice, because of this type of banking, invented double entry accounting. Another one of those revolutions that they are typically, in historiography, they're credited with. Well, my problem with that story, Mark, is that the Templars are doing the same thing on an international scale. So, in other words, they would have had themselves to invent some form of accounting that would have let them do this, namely double entry accounting. So, you've got this financial alliance, really, that starts between the Templars and Venice. And the way I look at it is Venice is kind of the military muscle for or pardon me, the Templars are kind of the military muscle for Venice. And of course, Venice eventually starts its own military. But it's an alliance basically that, we're seeing today. Think of the Templars as the Ford Foundation with guns. Okay, that's literally what they are.
Right. And obviously you can build a whole store of wealth just knowing these
Yeah.
techniques, banking and having the ability to move these, notes or pounds of gold, silver, whatever, what have you, across Europe, making this network stronger and stronger. But it seems that wealth is not just limited to currency. There was a sort of knowledge, maybe of
Right.
maps and of where treasure was, that seemed to be kind of at least the most interesting, right? That's where a lot of the interest in Templars comes from, is this
Right.
whole treasure thing. But it's very serious because the Fourth Crusade was pretty much, as you write, planned by these Templars, and they removed a lot of these holy objects, possibly, right? I mean, what were they looking
Well, what
for?
I think happened is that this Templar Venetian alliance, this to me is another fabrication of history, because at the time of the Fourth Crusade, the Doge of Venice is, of course, Enrico Dandolo, the celebrated blind Doge of Venice. Well, this guy literally leads the Fourth Crusade, which he arranged at the behest of some French knights. Okay, and that's the story. Well, substitute Templars for French knights. Okay, that's what's going on here. So the Fourth Crusade occurs, and Dandolo manages, according to the story, to divert the Fourth Crusade from Palestine to Constantinople, where he attacks his fellow Christians. Well, in my reading of all of this, I don't think the Fourth Crusade was ever meant to end up in Palestine. I think the whole thing was a front to get a military operation against Constantinople from the outset. And the reason why is that it's after the Fourth Crusade that something very fishy. This is like a mackerel on a moonlit beach, folks. This one shines and stinks. So it's after the Fourth Crusade that Venice, the Zeno brothers in Venice, go on this voyage. They claim to go on this voyage to the northern Orkney Islands in Great Britain. And from there, they join up with the prince of the Orkney Islands and journey all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World, long before this is, supposedly supposed to be happening with Christopher Columbus. All right. So what's going on? All right. When Venice conquers Constantinople, and this is both in Thrice Great Hermetica and in my book, The Financial Vipers of Venice. When Venice conquers Constantinople, they establish a fake Latin emperor in Constantinople. The Greek emperor goes across the straits, okay? So they establish a fake Latin empire. They impose a Venetian governor on that part of the empire that Venice has conquered. And the governor's last name happens to be Zeno. Okay? So there you go right there. So the Zeno brothers managed to make it all the way across to the New World and then back, and then they publish this map. Well, if you look at the map, what it looks like to me is it's a map based on those medieval portal lands that are circulating secretly in Western Europe. One of which is, or several of which, I think, become the basis of the Piri-Reis map, the map of the Turkish admiral that shows the coast of Antarctica. Some others of these maps eventually, I think, make their way into the hands of Christopher Columbus. So what's going on? What's going on is the Templars and Venice have gone to the New World looking for secret sources of gold, which they find with the Micmac Indians in Canada. Okay. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because at that time, Venice is basically controlling the LIBOR rate of the day. Venice is controlling the bullion markets of Western Europe, and doing so by manipulating gold and silver exchange ratios. And they're doing it in a particularly nasty way. If you're in Florence, you're on the receiving end of this Venetian economic war. So they do all of this because they have a secret supply of gold. The jig is up when a Genoan, Venice's major competition is Genoa in Italy, a Genoan by the name of Cristoforo Colombo, we know who that is, decides, okay, enough of this stuff. We're going to just open this all up. We're going to expose this secret supply of gold over here. And I know just who to do that. By Spain is handy. And oh, by the way, we happen to know some Templars that help Spain get to be Spain's. All you have to do, folks, is read between the lines in the history books and you'll see what's going on. Read the history books of the Middle Ages like you read the modern American newspaper or watch modern American television networks.
Yeah. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, it's fascinating. I've even heard that the Genoese knew of the New World for maybe a couple centuries before Columbus exposed
I think
it, right?
all of those cities, Genoa and Venice particularly, it's very clear because you've got with the Genoese, you've got the Knights Hospitaller tied in with them. So in other words, these military crusading orders plus the access to secret maps from Constantinople, which this is a very complex scenario I've tried to construct. Oh, here goes my dog. Through several books, but I think Constantinople becomes the home for these secret maps in the imperial archives, and they in turn are derived from exemplars that are brought to Constantinople from Alexandria. So in other words, the other thing I'm trying to get across here for people is quit looking completely at the West. Get out of your heads that Europe means Western Europe. You've got the whole Byzantine Empire that survived until the 15th century, quite literally, which is yet another European Christian civilization altogether. And they have imperial archives literally going all the way back to the earliest days of the Roman Republic. So in other words, there's all of this archival material sitting there in Constantinople, and the Byzantines are sitting on it precisely because, in my opinion, they know some of these traditions, that there's a whole other world over there. And once that happens, Byzantium's monopoly on the gold, silver, Silk Road trading route is broken. And Venice and Genoa get their hands on this, and that's when you really start to see the New World opening up, long before Columbus makes his voyage. All that Columbus does is he stages a voyage to make the announcement.
Right.
Let's remember what Queen Isabella says to Columbus. Sir, it's almost as if you have been there before. She really said that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, and it does seem like, as you say, the Moorish peoples would have had knowledge, right?
Sure.
Of this place, and I've even heard that they were sort of using the Straits of Gibraltar to keep anyone from Italy from going up towards the Northern Passage or even down towards the Southern Passage across the Atlantic Ocean.
That would make sense. And once the Moorish hold over Gibraltar is broken. And again, it's largely the Templars that enable that whole Reconquista. Once that happens, then you see this if you study the history of finances in medieval Europe and watch the money flows, follow the money, what begins to happen? Well, Venice, this watch what happens, what Venice does. After the War of the League of Cambrai, Venice, which has been in bed with the German banking family of Fuggers, the family that Luther rails about all the time. Venice has been in bed with the Fuggers family. After the War of the League of Cambrai, they start to liquidate the public debt. So, in other words, what that means is they're getting ready to move shop.
Right.
Where do they move? Well, the first step is north of the Alps to the Fuggers family. Look up a German family by the name of Turn und Taxis, or the Italian name Della Tasso e Toro. Okay, same family, just German and Italian versions of it. The Turn and Taxis family has a monopoly on the postage of the Holy Roman Empire, so they're swimming in money and they control the communications. So Venice, in other words, is liquidating its public debt so they can move. Where do they move? They move to another swamp, Amsterdam.
Yeah.
So in other words, if you look at the history of what's going on here, Genoa has chosen Spain to be their vehicle by which they continue their banking merchant ways. Venice has chosen Holland as its next port of entry into the global trade. And of course, eventually, Amsterdam skips across the pond with William of Orange. And what does he immediately do? Well, golly gosh, he starts the Bank of England.
Right. Right.
So we're off and running here, folks.
Right.
So in a way, you look at this, you're watching a group of people, terribly powerful, wealthy people, who've created this mechanism for the intergenerational transfer of wealth. And what they've effectively done is they've set up a foundation called the Templars. And what's the foundation? Well, it's also a tax haven.
Yeah.
It's crystal clear. Couldn't be any clearer.
Yeah. Well, and this starts to really crystallize, for me at least, why a lot of this New England, because I'm here in New England trying to piece this history together, a lot of it is ignored, specifically the archaeology. You talk about the Westford Knight and the Kensington Runestone, the Newport Tower. Yep. I've found others, some that I haven't seen in any books, big, what look like megalithic stones being
I can believe it. Yeah.
placed in positions that are, aligned with the stars. And, it really seems like they've gone great lengths to obfuscate any trace of advanced culture.
They have been
here.
Horribly successful of it, and I'll give you two examples. In a little town called Heavener, Oklahoma, which is in southeastern Oklahoma.
Okay.
There is what are called the Heavener rune stones. You can go to this place. It's a state park and look at these Viking runes on this stone in Oklahoma. Okay. So, somebody's over here doing something. Right. And on top of that, Thomas Jefferson, when he sends Lewis and Clark on their exploration journey, gosh, I wonder why he's doing that. Well, one of the things that he wants to do is he wants to find the alleged blonde-haired, blue-eyed Indians, the Mandan Indians, because he's been reading all of these stories about the Welsh having some sort of exploration on this continent long before Columbus. So again, this is kind of an open secret. It really is.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder if if there's another explanation for the secrecy. I mean, it seems like the banking in the United States is established in the Northeast for the most part. I mean, you have like this East Coast establishment, specifically in cities like Boston, New York City, and even places like Hartford and New Haven, Connecticut, which New Haven, Connecticut itself not only donned a sort of Templar-like flag for its
Yep.
colonial flag, but they designed their city in 9 squares, almost to, embody some sort of esoteric truth there. And I'm curious because you make a point about the 9 knights of the Templars,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm wondering where that symbology is expanded.
Ultimately, that comes from Egypt. And the reason why is I don't know if you're familiar with a Neoplatonic philosopher by the name of Plotinus. Well, he's the Neoplatonic philosopher. He's the guy that more or less is credited, along with another fellow by the name of N.E.M.M.E.S.S.I.S., that gets that whole tradition of Neoplatonism started. Well, Plotinus wrote a treatise called the Enneads, which, if you study classical philosophy, chances are sooner or later you're going to have to cut your teeth on the Greek of that text. It's a fairly lengthy philosophical text. But what Plotinus is doing in that book is he's laying out for a Greek speaking and reading audience. He's basically trying to summarize Egyptian mystery school teaching and philosophy. That's what he's doing. And therefore, the nines, the treatise Enneads means the nines. That's quite literally what it means. So this is coming from Egypt ultimately. And if you kind of do a comparative study of Plotinus, I don't want to do it now, but if you do, you'll quickly discover that the things that he's talking about have direct parallels in Egyptian religion. The Plotinian doctrine of the one, for example, is, I think, a kind of a disguised version of the Egyptian idea of Ma'at. And Ma'at, if you want to understand it, it's George Lucas's Force in Star Wars. That's all
Right.
it is.
Right.
So yeah, it's coming from Egypt, and it's coming out of an identifiable, if you will, an identifiable esoteric or metaphysical tradition.
Yeah. Yeah. And what even kind of expanded this idea, I don't know if you've ever been to New Haven, but Yale.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. So then you're probably familiar with Yale's, sort of Egyptian architecture, especially the gate of the cemetery, the tombs, and so on. But what struck me is that there is a sort of syncretism at play with this Ashmun character, right? And the Egyptian city of Ashmun, which also had the name Hermopolis, where they worship the sacred 8. I mean, you consider the fact that a 9 square grid is made by 8 roads. You sort of have this interplay of 8 and 9 going on in New Haven. Not to mention, in the center on the green, there is an 8 octagonal fountain, right? This is a sort of flagpole. So all of this kind of amounts to, modern day El Ashmun here in New Haven, with these sacred 8 gods being kind of headed by Thoth, right? And he is obviously Hermes and kind of connects to what we're talking about here today. Just sort of reciting facts at this point. I don't really have a question, but I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Well, I'm not, I didn't spend that much time looking around New Haven. So most of the esoteric references that you're talking about are lost on me. However, that said, I'm not surprised because I did spend a little time walking through the Yale campus. In fact, I walked by the tomb for Skull and Bones just out of curiosity. And my impression of the place was, quite frankly, that the whole thing was creepy. Because of all of these esoteric things that, like you say, that you see if you're paying attention, and all I can tell people is I had the same reaction to walking through the Yale campus as I have whenever I visit Swampington or DC, which I try not to do because the place creeps me out.
Right.
It just really does.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. The anecdote there, I've been to DC myself only once and had a similar
I don't blame
feeling.
you. That was probably enough.
Yeah. Well, moving on, it does feel like New Haven has a sort of place in this whole story.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly, you write about in your book the Brotherhood of the Bell, I believe, the
Mhm.
SS and the Brotherhood of the Bell. You
Mhm.
mention Skull and Bones, which of course finds its home in Yale University. It's a sort of second chapter of a German organization that goes
Mhm.
back to this German Illuminati. And we had a
Mhm.
character in New Haven history named Jedediah Morse, who was one of the first Americans to actually publicly make statements claiming there was an Illuminati at work. And
Mhm.
it was sort of threatening this New England Calvinist power structure that they had going on up there. And people probably are aware of Washington's statements on that, saying, oh yeah, we welcomed it, right? And he was sort of kind of
Mhm.
tongue-in-cheek there. But what do you think the veracity of that is? Like, maybe the Illuminati kind of invading the Ivy League through Yale. Do you think there's any truth there through?
I wow, yes, I do. You That's a whole new Pandora's box. And I would love someday to just to sit down and do a scholarly study on the links between basically what's become a kind of secularized Calvinism in this country with the progressives. Um, it's basically a form of Christianity without Christ. Um, and there are deep reasons. I wrote a book, just to let people know. I wrote a series of 4 books, and they are intensely theological books about the doctrine, the change in doctrine that was made in the 4th and 5th centuries by the West's most famous saint, Saint Augustine of Hippo. He changed literally everything. I'm Eastern Orthodox. So when I look at Calvinism, I see just another expression of Augustine of Hippo. And incidentally, it's because of his theological system that the two churches split. All right. So in other words, this is a very deep, long story. But my point here is that there are aspects within Augustine's system that lend itself very easily to a kind of penetration operation or co-option operation by groups like the Illuminati. It's very easily done. Let's remember that the Illuminati were founded basically by a Roman Catholic professor of canon law. That's Adam Weishaupt. And he maintained his professorship all the while that he's, starting all these conspiracies. And he recruits people from, all over Europe. And there are reasons why a person in his position would be led to do something like that. And there are reasons why that whole group would take off and become so influential and cross the channel and cross the ocean to the United States. If you look at the Bavarian Illuminati closely and carefully, and look at their doctrine, it's particularly there that you see the prototypes of Karl Marx. You see the whole idea of using Freemasonic lodges as kind of fronts for a much more dangerous type of conspiracy. You see all of this activity going on, and Calvinism, the kind of Calvinism that manages to get to places like Connecticut in this country, and then that Calvinism loses its religious aspect during that period of the 19th century and all of the revivals that flood New York and all of that stuff going on. And it's also that Calvinism that's really kind of in a certain roundabout way. It's behind Abraham Lincoln. What does Lincoln do? Well, he brings over all these Germans to this country who are coming out of the 1848 revolution, and all of these Germans join up in the Union Army. And you read some of these guys, and they're nothing more than early Marxists. So you've got these Marxist Republicans that are imbued with this secular Calvinistic philosophy on top of everything else, and they're off fighting those Anglican Southerners. So yeah, there's religious dimensions to all of this that are very profound. Anyway, I'm yammering and rattling on and on, but
no, not at all.
It's a the Calvinist thing in this country and the relationship with those kinds of secret societies, I think, is something that I can tell you from a scholarly point of view, it needs to be done. Anthony Sutton was probably the one that came the closest to dealing with that whole hornet's nest, but I think it was too big even for him to try and contemplate biting off.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, a lot of what I've learned comes from him and the man who's published his work, Chris Milligan, in his book, Fleshing Out Skull and Bones. To your point, it kind of compiles the views of several different people because it is quite a task. But yeah, I've, for the past 10 or so years, been fascinated with this as I went to community college in New Haven. And during my time there, before I dropped out, I met a gentleman who moved all the way to New Haven from Arizona, and he told me, yeah, of all the places to go.
That's a culture shock.
Right, and he certainly did not fit in. He stuck out like a sore thumb. He was a Native American, in fact, and him and I met, and we just perchance met, and he recognized something in me and began to tell me his story, and he told me that he came to New Haven in a sort of spiritual mission to avenge Geronimo, not by going and breaking into the tomb and taking
Good for him.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I've sort of helped him along the way in a sense by carrying the torch and looking into this information further. But at that age, I was like, who's this crazy guy telling me that Geronimo's locked away in this tomb? And
in the tomb at Skull and Bones.
Right. Well, and listen to this, because you stood on that very street. He would stand there every day at noon for a certain period of years, and he would stand in front of it at the tomb at noon, and from the bottom of his lungs, he would scream Geronimo's name, and his voice would just soar through the campus. And I had the honor of standing by while he did that one day, and it just stuck with me ever since. So there are people who are still haunted by that
sure.
In a way. And I think Skull and Bones is kind of haunted by its reputation with all this. But it's really fascinating, the nexus point that is Yale, because as you say, the Calvinist angle is yet to be fully parsed through. But when you look at so many of the ideas that have come from the Ivy League, particularly Yale's version of the Ivy League, you have, the foundation of the oil industry,
Yes.
turning, oil into a workable resource. And then not to mention paleontology, which, funny enough, kind of goes hand in glove with that whole subject, considering they call them, fossil fuels, right? So you have this interesting area of science that involves Darwinian evolution and a lot of these ideas that are now starting to be questioned by the more forward-thinking, conscious-oriented scientists, or maybe even the more traditional religious scholars too, who say dinosaurs never existed. But either
Got
way,
me in that camp.
Oh yeah, well, and
not that dinosaurs never existed, but I'm not a believer in fossil fuels, and I never have been.
Right.
And it was a realization as a little boy, as a matter of fact, that there were not enough dinosaurs to make all this oil.
Right.
It was a very simple realization. But the problem with this relationship that you see at Yale, I mean, the physical presence of this relationship is there. And the relationship is what exactly is going on with this secularized Calvinism and these secret societies. Why the mix? And I really don't think that aspect of things. Yeah, we have books like Fleshing Out Skull and Bones, but we really need a book of a scholarly study of this whole secularized Calvinistic movement and its massive influence on American history. And I would say predominantly deleterious influence on American history. You're opening such a Pandora's box here with that relationship, and I really don't think that since Anthony Sutton, I don't think we've had a scholar in this country that's been willing to go there, and part of the problem I think is due to the fact, and Sutton touches upon it. Carol Reese, or pardon me, not Carol Reese, Renee Wormser, the counsel for the Reese Committee in the House that was investigating foundations. He did, and he even very explicitly mentions in his book Foundations, Their Power and Influence. He mentions the connection to the medieval military orders and the resemblance between the modern foundations and those military orders. But I don't think, other than people like that this is an aspect of American history that most people are even aware of, and it's definitely there. You know, the New England old money, you know, the Cabots, the Lodges, you know, we can name all the families. They're very familiar to us in our history. But there are deeper connections to all these. The Delanos, you know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Delano family. They have all of these progressive Calvinistic and secret society associations, and they're involved in some pretty nefarious activity, like it or not.
Well, and it definitely, it seems to line up in their minds to some sort of justified means to an end, right? And given where we started this conversation off with the Fourth Crusades and the Templars' involvement in that, do you think there are parallels with, you know, presidents like Bush Sr. and Jr. and the war in the Middle East?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The Bush family is one of my least favorite families. You know, they're right at the bottom of my list, folks. But just the fact that you have both father and son. I call the son Bush the Stupid for your audience that's not aware of my nicknames for these people. But the fact that both the father and son were members of Skull and Bones, and the grandfather, the patriarch of the clan, Prescott Bush, also was a member of Skull and Bones, with his own dubious business dealings with Nazi Germany, of all things. Yeah, you're dealing. I think again, Mark, with this. This secularization of Calvinism. And what's one of the signs of election in Calvinism? Wealth. So when you remove any remaining Christian moral component and you still have that system, then you'll do anything to, you know, achieve your status as one of the elect and gain lots of wealth by hook or by crook. So yeah, the Bush family, and then, you know, the 2000, pardon me, I've got the hiccups. The 2004 election when, you know, Bush the Stupid is running against Kerry. You know, this is the Skull and Bones election. You know, both candidates are bonesmen. Right. So, you know, what's the choice here? I think American politics, because of this, is in a very, very nasty way, because it's becoming increasingly the politics of one faction of the deep state versus another, and that's all it is. So in other words, we're kind of watching a mafia. This is another analog that I've used on many interviews to try and convey to people the way it appears to me. And the way it appears to me is we're watching a mafia war.
Right.
You know?
Well, and this extends even to other countries, right? I mean,
Yes.
I heard you recently analyze the whole derailment situation, and it's very interesting to think that that was a false flag in the making that got thwarted. I mean, from that perspective, albeit the environmental damage, it is sort of, relieving to find out that there there are people thwarting that kind of effort. But if you don't mind, maybe expanding on that a little bit. And
Well, I was commenting. I think you're alluding to the fact that I was commenting on an article that appeared on Jeff Rentz's website
okay.
that was written by a Japanese fellow that is alleging that the presence of phosgene gas in the burn-off means much more than we're dealing with just vinyl chloride leaks. In his opinion, we're dealing with the preceptors of phosgene gas, actual mustard gas, World War I nasty stuff, and that this was being transshipped to a place in Pennsylvania, apparently some big marshaling yard that's just across the state line in Pennsylvania, and then from there possibly to Baltimore or some port on the East Coast for shipment to the Ukraine, where they would then use it as a false flag chemical attack. See, the Russians are using mustard gas. And it's interesting to me because within 2 or 3 days after that article appeared on Rentz's website, the head of Russia's atomic, biological, and chemical weapons defense actually came out and said pretty much the same thing, that Russia was worried about a false flag attack that would be blamed on the Russians using those types of weapons in the Ukraine. Now, Vladimir Putin has made it very clear that Russia's doctrine is no first use of those weapons. He's basically told everybody that their military policy is not that insane. And it isn't. It never has been. But, we're such dopes in this country, and we think that Putin is some sort of neo-Stalin, that, we'll believe anything the lamestream propaganda media tells us. But, it's insanity to think that they would do that. They don't need to do that to win the war in the Ukraine. They're doing fine enough job of that without atomic, biological, or chemical weapons. So, yeah, I think that there's a possibility that this Japanese gentleman was correct, that this may have been a last-ditch effort to derail that train before it got to the marshaling yards, and that shipment was lost, to barges or whatever. That may have been the case. I give it about a 30-70 chance that may have been the case. But as far as factions within this so-called government doing something like that, they are just insane to do something like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and when it's described in this way, like a mafia, it does make sense why they're okay with civilian casualties, because
exactly.
You realize that they're just fronting. This is this whole deal of protecting us is just a front.
Yeah.
The man with the biggest stick makes the rules. In the words of Teddy Roosevelt, carry a big stick and speak softly. And that seems like what they're doing, is very quietly behind the scenes clubbing each other over the head with big weapons. But this isn't history repeating itself, because as you've written at great length, the religious sort of texts that were uncovered around the same period that a lot of these Egyptian buildings were being created over here in the 18th and 19th century United States and France and Europe, there was this sort of Egypto craze because
Yep.
of what was being uncovered down there in Egypt. And it turns out that, yeah, this is history repeating itself. And the wars that we're seeing now over weapons, of mass destruction in the Middle East have happened before. And maybe even involve such anomalous structures like the pyramids. I was recently speaking with a friend of mine, author Lauren W. Jeffries, who's written a book called The Sacred Count. And upon telling him I'd be interviewing you, he said, "Oh, Mark, you have to ask Dr. Joseph about the," and I have it written down just so I don't get the numbers wrong, the 54 stones missing from the Great Pyramid and the 27 empty slots in the Grand Gallery chamber.
Well, the very first series of books that I did in alternative research was a trilogy of books. The first one was called The Giza Death Star. The second was Giza Death Star Deployed. And the third one was Giza Death Star Destroyed. I have just, in this last month, come out with a fourth book because those three books went out of print. So the copyright reverted to me. I had a friend republish them in their original form so that the books would stay in print. I've written a fourth book to kind of make my hypothesis in those first three books clearer for people and to update it a bit. My hypothesis, to be very blunt and not to take up much time with this subject, because again, we'd be here all day, but my hypothesis is that the Great Pyramid was a weapon, and an extremely powerful weapon of mass destruction at that. Now, that puts me way off the end of the twig of high-octane speculation, okay? And I know that sounds wild, incredible, absurd, crazy, wacky, and every other adjective you can think of, and I realize that. But it's actually not my idea. The person who had the idea and wrote a whole book about it in a kind of a roundabout way was Zecharia Sitchin. It's his idea. And when I read the book that he talks about it in, the book is The Wars of Gods and Men, I thought that, that's such a strange idea. It's amazing that nobody has followed up on it. Now, at the time that I was reading that book, Chris Dunn came out with his book called The Giza Power Plant. And I had met Mr. Dunn at a couple of conferences. And, I really think that book is the paradigm changer as far as the pyramid is concerned. Because when you approach that structure as he does, he's an engineer. And he's a materials engineer on top of that, a machinist, and so on and so forth. When you approach it with those kinds of spectacles and examine the structure, it becomes very clear that it was never intended nor built as a tomb. It was built as a machine. So that's what my books are about. So the 27 slots in the Grand Gallery, there's evenly spaced as you go up the Grand Gallery. There's this little ledge about 3 feet above the floor of the Grand Gallery on both sides of the Grand Gallery as it ascends up to the antechamber and the King's Chamber. Those 27 slots, Chris Dunn speculated, once held something. And what he thinks that they held were 27 banks of Helmholtz resonators. A Helmholtz resonator is simply a metal sphere with a hole cut in it, so that when the air moves across the whole of the sphere, it produces a musical tone. So it's like a flute, okay? The only difference being the Helmholtz resonator has only one tone. So what he's speculating was that the acoustic properties of the Grand Gallery were the perfect place for these resonators. Think of the Grand Gallery like I'm a pipe organist. That's the instrument I grew up as a boy playing. So I look at that thing and I see a big organ pipe. Okay. So yeah, it's an acoustic chamber. It's a resonating chamber, and he thinks that it was filled with these Helmholtz resonators. I go a step further in my books and say I think that they were filled with a special kind of crystal that was both optically and acoustically resonant to certain frequencies. And the reason I think that those kinds of harmonics are implied is when you examine the actual dimensional measures of the structure itself, you see abundant, redundant harmonics of dimensions in that structure over and over and over and over. You know, it's like me sitting at the console of a big pipe organ and I'm looking at all these numbers on the stops. You know, I know exactly what's going on. So I'm looking at all these numbers and I'm thinking, oh, well, these are all harmonics of each hit. So in other words, if you look at the dimensional analogs in the structure with an engineer's eye, again, you get a machine.
Right. And now, given the advanced nature of these pyramids in Egypt, do we have a sort of idea on where they relate to, let's say, for instance, the pyramids we see in Mesoamerica, and possibly if the cultures were connected at all? Was there a sort of, were these, weapons being used against each other, or maybe they were sort of weapons in a contiguous series?
An excellent question. Number one, I think the Great Pyramid is probably the oldest structure on the planet.
Wow.
Number two, I think it is sui generis. It's a thing unto itself. In other words, I don't think all other pyramids are weapons.
Okay.
Okay. I think only that one is, and for the specific reason that it does have, way beyond any other pyramidal structure in the world, it has nested harmonics and feedback loops that the only purpose of it could possibly have been to become a harmonic oscillator of any target in local space. So in other words, this is not a weapon that you point and aim. This is a weapon that you tune to aim. Okay? You tune it. That said, I do think, and I argue the case in another one of my books called Grid of the Gods. The subtitle of that is The Aftermath of the Cosmic War and the Physics of the Pyramid Peoples, because we find these structures not only everywhere on the planet. We find them in Mesoamerica. We find them in Serbia. We find them in China. We find them in Mesopotamia. On and on it goes. But here's the problem. We also find them on Mars. We find them on Phobos. We've found obelisks on the moon. So what the heck is going on here, folks? And I suspect that what you're dealing with, and I even talk about all of these other pyramids in the last book that just came out this month, the Giza Death Star Revisited. I think what's going on is that you're dealing with some group of people way back when that had essentially a very high and a very sophisticated physics. And what you're seeing on this planet with the pyramids at Teotihuacan or in Tikal in the Yucatan, what you're looking at is kind of a degraded legacy of a physics. And I get into all of that in Grid of the Gods. My speculation is, once again, you're dealing with structures that, for want of a better expression, are examples of a hyperdimensional physics. And there are reasons that I advance in those books for thinking that. So I'm not trying to make this up. I'm speculating, admittedly, but I'm speculating hopefully on the basis of some sound, either scientific or mathematical principles. That's my hope. I'm writing a book right now, incidentally, that is yet another another layer in this onion, and it's probably the most controversial layer. And I'm not even going to tell you what it is, because the book is going to have to come out for people to dive into that one. There are more aspects to the story, but I do think your question is an excellent one. And again, just to clarify, I think the Great Pyramid and the Great Pyramid alone is a weapon.
Thank you. Wow. Yeah, that is excellent. And considering the chain of connection there, I guess this only backs up what you posit in this Thrice Great Hermetica, where we started here in this conversation, where you cite sort of different Egyptian artifacts that have been found across America. And, there have been numerous authors who have taken a shot at maybe comparing the Native American cultures to this, group or that group. But one of the more fascinating candidates out of that, milieu is Elias Boudinot, who was one of the congressional presidents, right, before the Continental Congress, before it became the official, United States president. So he's one of those guys, the forgotten presidents, and he wrote a book called A Star in the West.
Oh, you're talking about the real presidents before the Philadelphia Constitutional Coup Convention. Yes.
Yes.
The pre-coup d'etat presidents. Yes.
Right.
All right. Go ahead.
And he was in kind of good favor with a lot of the founding fathers. I think he was actually one of the signers, Elias Boudinot. He wrote a book called A Star in the West that sort of claims that the Algonquins were the lost tribe of Israel, and there was
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, there's all these sort of things that they were looking at that time to boast that claim. And even here in my home state, there's a stone up on a mountain in the northwest corner that has Hebrew inscriptions on it. And obviously, like many of these things, they go, oh, that's just a hoax. But they're still there to this day. And, like the other archaeological sort of anomalies, they've been ignored. But there's this kind of case to be made that there's a very old lineage with the Native Americans. And as you say in your book that we're talking about here, Thrice Great Hermetica, there have been so many ventures to the New World before Columbus, for the most part by fishermen. But I was recently speaking with a gentleman by the name of Ross Ben, who wrote a book called Great Mystery Philadelphia. And in that book, he cites the journey of a man named Abu Bakr II, who was an African king, sent, something like 4,000 or 400 ships across the Atlantic using the Southern Passage. And mysteriously, that kind of coincides with the appearance of certain cultures in South America. And I'm wondering if you've looked into that at all, like the Olmecs.
I've looked into it, but only very briefly, but enough to convince me, since you mentioned the Olmecs. I defy anybody to look at those heads that they have found in Mesoamerica and tell me that they're not African. It's clear,
right?
And particularly if you examine some of the records in places like Timbuktu, there's some sort of traffic going on between Africa and the New World, and it's got nothing to do with Christopher Columbus. And there are stories, repeated stories over and over again of people finding Egyptian artifacts in the American Southwest. Well, what's Egypt doing there? There are Egyptian mummies in Egypt that are buried with cloth that have little seeds and so on of American tobacco. How does that get there?
Right.
Well, the obvious answer is somehow Egypt is conducting some sort of trade. There's no other explanation. I think, I'm not a modern American quackademic. I just don't believe the quackademic narrative. And the quackademic narrative is that somewhere circa 4,000 or so BC, if you follow Archbishop Usher's dating, which I don't, incidentally, but somewhere circa 4000 BC, we human beings all of a sudden stopped thinking that we are going to be hunter gatherers, and we invent civilization just like that. I'm sorry, I don't believe that narrative. I just don't. I think we have to take the narratives of those ancient civilizations about themselves much more seriously than we do. Right. And those narratives are all of a piece. We and our civilization are much older than the quackademic narrative would have it. We didn't stop hunting and gathering and all of a sudden decide to invent mathematics and calendars and domesticate animals. It's a narrative that makes no sense, because it cannot ultimately account for why you have civilizations like Sumer and Egypt to begin with. They're just all of a sudden there in the record. Now, civilizations don't just sprout. They don't. I'm sorry. We don't abandon teepees to start building pyramids. It doesn't happen that way. Particularly pyramids that have the degree of engineering in them that we see in Egypt. Doesn't happen.
Right.
So it's coming from somewhere. And since you mentioned Olmecs and the strangeness of finding all of these African artifacts in Mesoamerica, let's talk about the Zulus for a moment in southern Africa. And again, this is just one little detail, but it's the black swan detail. The Zulu tribe has as part of its lore that they came here from Mars. Wow. And that they came here, get this, on what they call a Merkaba, a boat. Okay. Now, what is the Hebrew word Merkaba doing squatting in the middle of a Zulu tribal legend?
Wow.
So on and on it goes. How many anomalies do we in the alternative community have to pile up before the quackademic narrative propagated by such universities as Yale collapse? How many does it take? It's my version of the question that we ought to be asking the progressives. How much progress is enough? They don't have an answer. And the reason they don't have an answer is it's the technique of progress itself that they're really all about, and the maintenance of power. That's all it's about.
And speaking of progress, it almost seems futile given that history tells us, as you've been citing, that there's sort of a de-evolution from an advanced state to this. I mean, in the medieval, what we're told about the medieval period, at least from the Renaissance perspective, it was utter chaos, right? And
no, it wasn't that at all. I mean, come on, folks. The Middle Ages were not the Dark Ages.
Right.
People like Thomas Aquinas or Albert the Great are not stupid people.
Well, and it seems like what they were describing is really what we're heading for, is the Dark Ages.
Exactly. We're heading for something far darker than the Middle Ages ever were or ever dreamed about being.
Yeah.
But the problem with the modern view is, I think you're absolutely right. In a certain sense, we have become so accustomed to this secularized Calvinistic idea of progress that we can't see devolution if it came up and slapped us in the face. The way I look at Egypt is exactly the way that Alan Alford looked at it, in that the oldest level of construction at Egypt, namely the Great Pyramid itself, was also the highest level of perfection. Then you had a slight decline in quality that you see evident in the Sphinx or the Valley Temples or the second big pyramid at Egypt, the Pyramid of S.E.E.E.N. And then you had another period of further decline, a third layer of construction that began with Egypt itself. And you had the red and the bent pyramids at Dashur. And it's very interesting when you look at those pyramids, those are, in Alford's opinion, the oldest actually Egyptian pyramids built by Egyptians. And they are of the highest quality. Go to other truly Egyptian pyramids and they're falling apart. Oftentimes you can't tell them apart from a mound of sand. So in other words, construction quality devolved. In my thinking, Mark, what you had happen, the reason for the devolution was they fought a big war with that weapon, blew up a planet. Yeah, Star Wars happened right here in this solar system eons ago. What's the asteroid belt? It's an exploded planet. It's exactly what it is. And that's exactly what the 19th century astronomers thought it was. It was an exploded planet. By the way, those 19th century astronomers, guess what they named that planet? Krypton.
Wow.
Getting the picture?
Yeah.
Somebody knows something.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's fascinating. Given we were just talking to Chris Knowles about his book, Our Gods Wear Spandex, which deals with Superman and all those characters.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Very fascinating. Now, given what we're looking at here with this sort of, encoded truth about this planet's destruction, do you think... Oh, I had a question loaded up. Give me a second, and it'll come back to me. The bloodlines. So let me rephrase this. So given what we know about the pyramids, you write that there are certain people within the Rex Deus sort of, or this is a theory. I don't know if this is you believe in this or not, but you're citing this theory about how the bloodline is somehow connected to the use of this technology, and that only certain people, depending on their DNA, can even interact with the pyramid technology.
That is my impression. I wrote another book in this whole series of books called The Cosmic War. The subtitle of that book is probably worth mentioning. The subtitle is Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics, and Ancient Texts. And one of the things that emerges, it's one of those obvious things that you don't think about unless you stop to think about it. One of the things that emerges in all of those ancient texts, be they, the Greek texts about the war with the giants, or the Mesopotamian texts, and the wars between Marduk and Tiamat, doesn't matter. One of the things that emerges from these texts is that the people wielding these weapons have to be either in close physical proximity to them or actually touching them. So what that suggested to me at the time I was doing The Cosmic War, and I should qualify this because of the book I'm writing now. At the time I was doing The Cosmic War, I was not laying down all the cards in my hand. I'll get back to that in a moment. But if you look at these texts, the thing that is an obvious thing is that these gods, whoever they were, that are fighting each other, either are in close proximity to the weapons they're using, or they are actually in physical contact with them. So that suggested to me that there's a biometric component to them. If nothing else, a biometric component that, so to speak, unlocks them and permits their use, like, a simple matter of a retinal scan. Okay. Now, when I originally wrote the first book, this is the part that people have to understand, and I mean it very seriously. I've planned these books out oftentimes years ahead of actually writing them. So when I did the Giza Death Star, I purposely told the publisher I have more books in mind about this if this one does well. And it did, and so I started writing the other books. And that's why all the books are interlocked. You just have to read them, and you'll find out that they are all interlocked very tightly. When I did the original Giza Death Star book, if you've read my books, I love epigraphs at the beginning of chapters. And in the original book, I put in an epigraph in that original book. I bundled up the book and sent it off to a publisher. And while I'm waiting for the publisher, I continue to crunch my numbers. I love to crunch numbers. So in the meantime, the publisher I originally sent the book to sent it back to me, rejected, don't want it. And I thought, what a lucky strike, because now I can include all these numbers that I've just crunched. So I rewrote the book, and I took out one epigraph in the book. And the reason I took it out, Mark, was I thought, having crunched more numbers, I thought, no, I don't even want to dangle this out there because I will have to write about it, and there's not enough to write about it at this stage. So I've been hinting around this epigraph and what it implies ever since the Cosmic War. When I redid the new Pyramid book, Giza Death Star Revisited, you can go on my website and people will tell you, I've warned them, I've restored that epigraph. I'm not going to tell you folks what it is because you guys are going to spot it immediately. And sure enough, one of my friends, Walter Bosley, has spotted the epigraph. Okay. The epigraph has to do also with this component of biometrics. But it has to do with that component in a very roundabout way that most people wouldn't think of. Okay? That's a hint. It's a rare hint. I never give hints on programs, but that's a hint.
Wow. Well, we appreciate it here on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And
they'll really think you're crazy if you show up this interview.
Well, let me tell you this, a little anecdote.
That guy is a crackpot, Mark. Don't get him on again.
I think I actually brought your book, Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, to a Thanksgiving one year.
Oh, dear.
And I was reading it on the couch while others were watching football, and just one glance at the cover, and people were like,
the cover? I was just thinking that.
People were like, oh, yeah, let's just let Mark read. We're not going to get into a conversation about this now. But, yeah, they're well aware of my odd interests. And you're right at home. Given the name of the show, do you have that same thing going on, that same dynamic with your family?
Well, most of my family, they thought I was nuts long before I started writing about all this stuff. Oh, so yeah, this just confirms it for them.
Right. That's exactly how my family feels about the name of this show. So yeah, they listen from time to time to support. I don't think they retain any of the information, but they listen. So, but speaking of families, these families are that we've talked a little bit about today, specifically the Xenos and other interesting folks. They have a very, well-documented sort of lineage, right? But there's a person that you mention in this book where the opposite is true, and that would be the very famous William Shakespeare, who you spend some time talking about. And there's been, all sorts of claims on who Shakespeare really was, from Francis Bacon to, since I don't have any other examples, you posit it may be Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. And I'm curious to know, where does Shakespeare fit into this whole sort of paradigm with the secret societies? Because it seems relevant. And B, why do you think it's de Vere?
Well, I think it's de Vere largely on the basis of Mark Anderson's book, Shakespeare by Any Other Name, which lays out the De Vere case. I You're talking to somebody that was a Baconian in the seventh grade. Okay, so since I've been in the seventh grade, I've been on this uh, not so much an anti-Shakespeare kick, but that Shakespeare couldn't possibly have written these plays, and Bacon certainly would have been capable of doing it, as would have been Edward de Vere. Um, and I'm not opposed to the idea that maybe both men had their hands in certain plays, or maybe even collaborated. Who knows? but my principal reason for thinking this is, if you look at certain plays, one of my favorite being one that's not really considered one of Shakespeare's best, and that's Henry VIII. When you look at some of his plays, like the historical plays, or plays like The Merchant of Venice, that I talk about a great deal in Thrice Great Hermetica, you're dealing with someone whose depth of knowledge of things, be it a historical tidbit that could not possibly have come from a middle-class man from Stratford-on-Avon, but somebody who's part of the establishment of the day. Stop and think of all the little tidbits that are dropped in Henry VIII or Henry V, some of those political plays. Or stop and think of the allusions to occult doctrine and practice in The Tempest. Or stop and think of, I went into a great deal of explanation in Thrice Great Hermetica of the underlying structure of The Merchant of Venice, which, according to one scholar, appears to be nothing but a representation of the Kabbalistic Sephirot, the tree of life from Kabbalah, in the way that the characters are actually related to each other. When you put them all together, they resemble the connections of the Sephirot and the Kabbalah. So you can't get somebody like a William Shakespeare from Stratford-on-Avon that knows anything about the Sephirotic tree of life in the Kabbalah. That just doesn't. It's just not going to be the kind of book that's sold at your local pub or your local chemist. It just isn't, especially at that time. So yeah, I think you have to look at some of these references in the Shakespearean output and conclude that whoever's writing these things was a very well-connected, highly educated individual who also had a very thorough knowledge on aspects of esoteric or occult practice at the time. Think of whoever the real Shakespeare is in terms of Spenser and the Fairy Queen, because again, you're dealing in that particular poem with a heavily esoteric work. Think of whoever the real Shakespeare was as a Percy Shelley, if you've read Shelley's poems, with all of their deep allusions to esoteric doctrines. You're dealing with that kind of individual. A William Shakespeare that can barely write his name? No, I don't think so.
Mm. Well, and do you think that in the same way Columbus kind of merely took the rap for, opening up the new world for the public consumption, even though it had been privately known about for centuries? Do you think Shakespeare plays that same role with esoterica, kind of seeding it into the public consciousness? And then you see 17th, 18th, 19th century progressively more and more is unveiled to the point where now we're living in a sort of occultic world.
Yes, I do. And Christopher Columbus, I spent a great deal of time with him in this connection in that book, because there is a case to be made that he's the son of Pope Innocent the Eighth. Okay, Chibo is the family name of Pope Innocent the Eighth, and again, when you're dealing with the Renaissance popes, you're dealing primarily with people that have at some point a very heavy esoteric interest. Think of the Borgias. Think even of the de Medicis in Florence. You're dealing with people that have, Cosimo de' Medici is the man responsible for finding the Hermetica and having it translated. And again, where does he find it? Well, he finds it in Constantinople. So, please don't forget about us folks over in Eastern Europe, because that's part of the story. Cosimo de' Medici is another one of these figures, like many of the Renaissance popes, that are up to their earlobes with esoteric involvement. And like I say, I think there are deep-seated theological reasons that you find this going on in the West, and not the East. If you look at modern-day Russia, if you look at Putin's Russia, it's going in exactly the opposite direction. They're building churches and mosques and synagogues in the former Soviet Union at a breathtaking pace. I mean, and they're doing it with government money. So, something is happening in Russia that is exactly the opposite of what we see going on in the West. And I do think that you've got, with the Shakespeares and the Chibos and Christopher Columbus and so on, I think you have a group of people that have been more or less kind of staging these theater events, as you say, to seed certain concepts into the culture. Because we still view, in spite of all the mountains of evidence to the contrary, we still view Columbus as, quote unquote, the discoverer of the New World. Why? Well, that was the role that was intended for him. They had to create a Narra-digm, as the word I use for a combination narrative and paradigm. They had to create a Narra-digm for people to latch on to.
Yeah.
And drive these concepts into society.
Absolutely, yeah, and we see this even back to New Haven with one of the tallest buildings in Knights of Columbus, right? And I'm sure they have a whole sort of story. Do you know anything about their sort of founding and how they came to be?
I don't know enough about the Knights of Columbus, other than it always kind of impressed me that this was the papal response to the desire of Roman Catholics to join a lodge.
Right.
That's always the way it struck me. However, the fact that they're named Knights of Columbus makes me extremely suspicious as to what may really be going on, particularly if you buy the hypothesis that Columbus was an illegitimate son of Pope Innocent VIII. So, what else do we want?
Yeah. Wow, it's fascinating. And on the point of the church, maybe not the Catholic Church, but circling back to our talk about the pyramid and its harmonic nature, we have this same thing going on with cathedrals, specifically, Rennes-le-Chateau, and possibly that even encodes some Templar secrets. But do you think this falls in the same line of trying to mimic?
Wait a minute.
Correct me, please.
Wait a minute, Mark. We're missing the big one here.
Tell me.
The Rosetta Stone.
Ah.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, we all know the story. The story is that the Rosetta Stone was translated by the French linguist Champollion, okay, after it was discovered in Egypt during Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt. Now, stop right there. Napoleon Bonaparte in Egypt. What the dickens is Napoleon Bonaparte doing in Egypt? Well, he took basically all of France's intelligentsia and half of the French Navy and an army with him to Egypt. By the way, stopping off at Malta along the way, which should set off a few alarm bells. He makes it to Egypt, defeats the Ottoman Mameluke army there, becomes master of Egypt, and then spends a night inside the Great Pyramid in the king's chamber, emerges the next day, according to the story, ashen. And this is a guy that doesn't scare that easily, folks. Emerges from the Great Pyramid ashen and never talks about it, apparently, and allegedly, until the end of his life. And on top of all of this, here it comes, folks. The fellow who discovers the Rosetta Stone, do you know what his family name is? Hautpoul. Huh. Now, that name should ring a bell, because if you're really familiar with the story of Baron Garçonnier and Rennes-le-Chateau, the Hautpoul family is hugely involved with the story.
Okay.
So we have a Napoleon Bonaparte, Rosetta Stone, Hautpoul, Rennes-le-Chateau connection here to Egypt. And on top of this, if you really want to go back to cathedrals now, when Baron Garçonnier, or Saunier, pardon me, makes whatever that weird discovery was that made him fabulously wealthy overnight, what's the first thing he does? Well, according to the story, he goes to his local bishop. This is just a poor French village priest, after all, who found something. And the bishop says, well, I don't know what to do with this, so I'm sending you to Paris, which he does, and he sends him to the church of Saint-Sulpice de Paris, okay? And Berengar, after his trip to Saint-Sulpice, comes back to Rennes-le-Chateau, spends massive amounts of money that no one really knows where he's getting it from. One of the Habsburg dukes, by the way, just happens to be passing through that village, visits Baron Garçonnier. So what's going on here? Well, the Church of Saint-Sulpice de Paris is a classical era church. It's not a Gothic cathedral. It's a huge church. It's also the church that was picked for the Paris Prime Meridian during the Revolution. In fact, the film version of Dan Brown's novel, where they show the Prime Meridian, takes place in the Church of Saint-Sulpice. That really is Saint-Sulpice that's being used for Saint-Sulpice in the movie. It is, in my opinion, a heavily alchemical building, because Saint-Sulpice is also the headquarters, the nerve center, so to speak, for all sorts of liberal Catholicism in late 19th century France, including royalist, monarchist, restoration, conspiracy, secret societies, and on we could go. Being a pipe organist, Saint-Sulpice is a particular favorite of mine, because the famous French organ builder Cavalier-Cole built his largest pipe organ at Saint-Sulpice. It was the church that was the headquarters of one of my favorite composers, Charles-Marie Widor, who incidentally was the instructor of Albert Schweitzer. So in other words, you're not dealing with a fly-by-night organist, very famous French organ virtuoso and composer. So something's going on at Saint-Sulpice. And one of the clearest indicators that this is all connected somehow is the fact that many of these 19th century French alchemical secret societies had their headquarters in or around Saint-Sulpice. Baron Garçonnier goes there. So there's something going on in this church that nobody knows why it's so significant. The Ile-de-France, the Ile-de-Cité is the island that Notre Dame sits on. So why Saint-Sulpice? You would have thought that with Notre Dame being quite literally the center of the French nation, that all of these societies would be clustered there. Why Saint-Sulpice? Nobody knows. I don't know. But wow. They are, I think, alchemical buildings.
Now, considering the placement, the very, very, very specific placement of the Great Pyramid, do you think it could be a similar explanation there?
Oh, I am absolutely, and I cover this in my pyramid books, and I cover it again in the one I'm finishing up now. I'm absolutely foursquare agreed with those people in the alternative research community that have made the case that the ancient prime meridian ran right through the apex of the Great Pyramid. And the reason I think that, the most well-known reason is that if you look at the surface landmass of the globe, the Scottish astronomer royal Piazzi Smythe, when he studied the Great Pyramid, he actually included a little diagram in his book that shows the location of the Great Pyramid is almost in the exact geographical center of the landmass surface of the planet.
Right.
Okay. The other reason being, and there's a fellow way back in the 80s and 90s, I think he's dead now, by the name of Carl Munk, that worked out all of the mathematics of the so-called world grid. But the mathematics only works for places like Angkor Wat or Teotihuacan, places like this. The mathematics only works if Giza is the prime meridian.
Wow.
Yeah. So, what that's telling me is that used to be kind of a seat of government for the planet.
So it was more of a political necessity to have your French prime meridian, and then now we have the Greenwich prime meridian after the United Kingdom kind of had its day in the sun. Right. Yeah. Wow.
Right.
Now, considering that France was the sort of nexus of the Templars, there's another connection between the New Haven area and France, and Chris Milligan actually mentions it in the book here, and he sort of remarked at the eerie architecture at Yale, and it reminded him of the Saint Denis Basilica near Paris.
Saint Denis.
Saint Denis, yeah, and I'm curious if there's any lore about that area and its connection to these sort of esoteric practices.
Saint Denis, oh yeah. I don't know if you've ever read Saint Denis of Paris. First of all, he's named after Dionysius the Areopagite, that is referred to in the Book of Acts, and there was or is a body of work in patristic Christian literature that purports to be by Dionysius the Areopagite. Most scholars think that this body of work represents a style of Greek that is much later than anyone writing, the kind of Keene Greek that was used at the time of St. Paul or Christ. So they usually refer to this figure as pseudo-Dionysius. But in any case, that Dionysius or pseudo-Dionysius wrote 3 theological treatises. One is called The Divine Names. The next one is called The Celestial Hierarchies, all about angels. And then the third one is called The Mystical Theology. Now, Saint Denis, or Denis of Paris, is named after this guy that's writing these treatises. And Saint Denis of Paris is, if you look for his treatise, what he is doing is he's basically laying kind of the philosophical groundwork for the Gothic style, and in particular, laying the groundwork for rose windows and stained glass and all of that. Because if you look at his theological writings, what he talks about constantly is light. You know, he's all about light. So many people attribute the Gothic style and the philosophical influences behind it to Saint Denis of Paris. So he's a very significant figure. So yeah, it's not surprising that Saint Denis, Saint Denis de Paris, would be, you know, a place where you're going to encounter a lot of this alchemy. Because again, I'm one of those that thinks there's something alchemical going on in stained glass. That they knew something that we've lost.
Yeah.
In terms of their art. Now, to whet the whistle a little bit for people, being a pipe organist, you know, there is nothing at all in the world of music. I don't care who you're talking about and what rock star and what guitar riff. There is nothing in the world of music that can compare to the feeling that you get when you are playing one of those instruments in one of those large church buildings or listening to one of those instruments. Nothing like it in the world. And the reason why is with a pipe organ, unlike any other musical instrument, guitars, violins, pianos, whatever, with a pipe organ, you're sitting inside the sound box. The instrument is not external to you. It literally vibrates the whole building and, you know, the foundations. It's an enormously powerful instrument. If you don't believe me, go get a hold of Gaston Litte's performing the last movement of Saint-Saëns' organ symphony on an organ that is absolutely blasting the whole orchestra right out of the building. It's just incredible work. Now, the reason I mention all of this with cathedrals is I've had a suspicion for some time that there's a hyperdimensional physics aspect for why they're putting these enormous instruments in these gigantic buildings. Well, if you look at a Western cathedral, they're built in a cruciform pattern, okay? That pattern is a three-dimensional representation of what's called a tesseract, which is a hypercube. And a hypercube is like a cathedral, but in 4 dimensions, okay? So in other words, the central arm of the cathedral would be kind of sticking up at perpendicular angles to the 2 arms of the cross, okay? You've got the 2 arms coming out. What I'm saying that a tesseract is there would be 2 more arms right where the cross intersects. There would be 2 arms coming out perpendicular to that whole structure. That's a tesseract. So in other words, by their very geometry, cathedrals are analogs of something in 4 spatial dimensions. Now you add vibration to that picture, where you're literally vibrating the building. And now you're dealing with a hyperdimensional physical effect. So, yeah, there's something, I think, of a very mysterious nature going on in these cathedrals in the West, particularly the big Gothic ones, because they appear to me to be designed to, just like the pyramid, designed to oscillate and resonate with certain frequencies that are ultimately tied to the earth itself. You know, if you're playing a pipe organ, you're vibrating that whole building, and that whole building in turn is setting up a waveform in the surface of the planet. It's powerful stuff. And if you're familiar with cymatics, you know, the Japanese guy that experimented with water molecules and sound waves, then, you know, what are we? We're big sacks of water. and you've got this musical instrument that's, shaking the building. So what's it doing to you?
Right. Oh, could a carillon work in a similar manner? One thing I learned is that Yale has a bell carillon in one of
Oh,
their
Carillon.
towers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Carillon. Yeah, I
Yeah.
know what you're saying. I thought you meant the Carillon photography. No, Carillon, yes. Any system of harmonics, I think, is dealing, particularly, harmonic music, is dealing with a physics of waveforms.
Mm.
All a pipe organ is an analog synthesizer. That's all it is. It's a wave mixer.
Right.
So yeah, any musical instrument is going to have harmonic effects. I think we're only beginning to understand. I think, by the same token, that composers up until the end of the 18th century, they were working with a very different cosmology than composers after that point. I think that composers up to that point, at least were aware of techniques in music that they could use, and they did use them, and they used them consciously in order to manipulate certain intellectual and emotional effects. They did this thing constantly.
It's absolutely fascinating to think you could find yourself inside of an instrument like that. And as you described the tesseract, I could think of a dozen different examples of where I've seen this symbol. One, for instance, is at the Red Cross headquarters here in Connecticut. They have a giant tesseract, sort of.
They have a representation of a tesseract.
Yeah. Yeah, very fascinating.
The cross at Henday that Jay Widener wrote a book about is another 3-dimensional representation of a tesseract. Wow. And speaking of which, we're talking about actual mathematics here, folks. This is a book about this kind of higher dimensional mathematics written by the man who did it. So it's very real stuff. We're not making this stuff up. And I think personally, Mark, that when you're talking about this kind of higher dimensional physics or whatever, I think you're talking about harmonics ultimately, because that's what activates it. That's what taps into that stuff. That's why we have such strong reactions, to our favorite piece of music or whatever. Music is very much a part of this way of thinking.
Right.
It's absolutely a very, very important part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great part of this book that we have talked so much about, Thrice Great Hermetica, and there's just so much more in this book that we just couldn't get to naturally. So still, folks, please go and check this out. But I know we don't have that much more time here, so I want to be careful with my questions. I could ask you so many more. I initially brought up Saint Denis because is he the one who was decapitated and carried his head around town, or is that someone who maybe...
Now, I don't know enough of the story about his life. I think you may be correct, but I hesitate in saying absolutely for sure.
Because
I have to look it up.
Because there's this connection with the Templars and St. John the Baptist and his head, which possibly was used as some sort of oracle, or I don't know, but I ask this because obviously Skull and Bones has this same preoccupation of collecting skulls in their tomb there. So is there any alchemical significance to this? Do you think maybe they use these skulls as gauntlets or just as, crystal balls? I mean, what is the extent of this?
Ultimately, and I did not say this in Thrice Great Hermetica, I think by that time the Templars are... Let me put it this way. I think by that time, the Templars have kind of lost the original reason for their preoccupation with what becomes their head. Okay. In other words, it started out one thing and ended up something else.
Right.
Okay. I think what starts it is the Shroud of Turin, quite frankly. In other words, it's a relic that they were able at some point to get their hands on. And that relic, if you study the history of the Shroud of Turin, prior to its discovery, when you look at iconography, ancient iconography of Christ, he's depicted in all sorts of ways. After the discovery of the Shroud of Turin, which in the Greek church is called the Holy Napkin or the Mandilion, and the records go back to about the 5th century when we see the first mention in a post-New Testament writing of this particular burial shroud of Christ. All right. It's after the discovery of that relic that you see the iconography of Christ begin to resemble the face on the Shroud of Turin. So in other words, it's very clear that the shroud itself is much older than the Middle Ages because it has an effect on Christian art. Okay? That's what I think is at the core of the Templars' obsession with heads. They were simply venerating an icon. They're venerating a relic. That's all it was. I think by the time you get to Philippe le Bel and the Inquisition, that there are Templar lodges that have somehow lost the original focus and may be literally venerating a head, a skull, or something like that. Humans are humans, and these types of things happen. And I think there's a good possibility that this happened to the Templars. And I do not rule out the possibility that some Templar lodges may have veered off into just outright occult practice and abandoned any pretense to Christian orthodoxy. I don't discount that either. But my point here being that I think you have to be very careful in looking at the Templars as a monolithic organization. They're no more monolithic than modern day Masonry is. You've got all types, you've got different emphases from lodge to lodge, and I think you're dealing with much the same phenomenon with the Templars. About the only monolithic institutions that managed to preserve, at least at that time, managed to preserve some semblance of institutional conformity is the church itself. And even there, you're dealing with an institution that has to recognize different emphases and so on, even in its own piety. Otherwise, you wouldn't have all these religious orders springing up during the Middle Ages.
Right. Well said. Thank you so much for venturing with me down these various sectors of history that have been, largely ignored, but brought forth here in your many great books. And, given that you've written so many, my final question for you before we wrap up is, what keeps you motivated to keep writing new books? Obviously, you have multiple books still down the pipeline, right? I mean, what's
Well, actually, I took over the last 2 years. I kind of took time off. This year, I'm back in the writing of books. Basically, I guess I'm one of these people that looks at a subject and likes to circle around it several times and turn it upside down. And there's a certain amount of repetition in my books, but the repetition is never exactly the same because I'm looking at something from a slightly different point of view. So I like to consider all the implications, all the alternatives. So I keep writing, that's why I do it. And in things like the pyramid, research changes. When I wrote the original pyramid books, for example, it had not yet been proven that Colonel Weiss forged those hieroglyphics that supposedly contained the Khufu cartouche in the relieving chambers of the Great Pyramid. It was strongly suspected by some in the alternative community that he had. But in the last 5 years, someone proved it. Okay? So that's a case where I had to update things. We have now a new chamber that has been found in the Great Pyramid. They've sent a little probe down that chamber to show people what it looks like. I mentioned it briefly in the new Pyramid book. I have a blog coming up this Wednesday that will talk about this new chamber. I don't think it changes any aspect at all of Chris Dunn's or my hypothesis. However, that said, I think Egyptology would be just desperate enough to concoct another hoax and another forgery with respect to it. I really do. Somebody wants to keep that structure firmly dated to the 4th century BC and firmly in the hands of Khufu. Somebody. So you have to update things. That's just the way things are.
Well, I give thanks because very few have written at the level that you've written and at the length and depth. So, I mean, I think you deserve a great big thanks from this community for all the work you've put in and sort of validating these subjects because, you know, if it weren't for scholars like you, all of our families would think we're nuts. So little by little.
It's interesting you mentioned that because when I started down this path years ago, I had no idea that it was going to turn into a full-time career. I had not the slightest clue. But I did intend at the outset that, by golly, if I'm going to write about this stuff, I'm going to do it in an academic style and with as much fidelity to academic standards of documentation and referencing as I can. So people have to be warned that my books are very heavily footnoted. You know, they're going to put an epitaph on my gravestone. He lived for footnotes. That's what it's going to read.
Oh gosh, well, rightly so that your epitaph has a footnote, but yeah, that's
probably will.
Wonderful. All right, well, Doctor, you have so many books available for folks, and it's really great to hear that you're resurrecting those books that went out of print. But folks can go to GizaDeathStar.com. Is there anything else you'd like to promote before we wrap up? Obviously, you have some new books in the works.
That's it. So. Thanks for having me on, Mark. I appreciate it.
Right on. Well, folks, please go over and support Dr. Farrell online or by tuning into a podcast like this. And wherever you are, immerse yourself in the moment, wherever you are in the now.